The elevator doors closed behind Ava Carter with a soft metallic whisper, sealing away the laughter that still echoed in her memory. For a moment she stood alone inside the mirrored walls, the city lights of Manhattan glittering through the glass tower like distant constellations. 40 floors below, the streets pulsed with evening traffic and quiet ambition, unaware that one woman's life had just split into two separate futures. Ava did not rush. She did not tremble. Her breathing remained calm, measured, the same way it had been during the most difficult negotiations of her career. Yet inside her chest something had shifted with quiet finality, like a door closing inside a long hallway. The elevator descended slowly, each passing floor marked by a gentle chime that sounded almost ceremonial. 39, 38, 37. Each number carried away another piece of the life she had built beside William Harrington. 5 years of shared penthouse mornings. 5 years of investor galas and quiet Sunday coffee overlooking Central Park. 5 years of believing that respect was the foundation of their marriage. When the elevator reached the lobby, the marble doors opened to reveal the calm elegance of the Astoria Crown's entrance hall. A pianist in the corner continued playing a soft jazz melody, completely unaware that upstairs an entire room of billionaires had just laughed at a woman's dignity. Ava stepped onto the polished floor, her heels tapping gently against the marble as she crossed the lobby. No one stopped her. The doorman nodded politely, opening the glass doors with practiced grace. Outside, the autumn air of Manhattan carried a cool bite that brushed against her skin like a quiet awakening. Yellow taxis moved along Fifth Avenue, their headlights reflecting across the pavement like streams of gold. The city continued exactly as it always did, relentless and indifferent. Ava paused on the sidewalk for the first time since leaving the table. Behind her, 40 floors above, William Harrington was probably still finishing his dinner. Perhaps someone had already poured another glass of wine. Perhaps the laughter had faded into awkward silence. She did not look back to find out. Instead, she slipped her hand into the small evening clutch she carried and removed her phone. The screen illuminated her face softly in the dark. For several seconds, she simply looked at the list of contacts, her thumb hovering above a name that represented nearly half of her adult life. William Harrington, the man who had once told a room full of investors that Ava Carter was the most brilliant strategist he had ever met. The same man who tonight had turned their marriage into a casual joke. Ava studied the name quietly, then exhaled once and pressed delete. The contact disappeared from the screen. No drama, no speech, just absence. She slipped the phone back into her bag and stepped forward into the stream of Manhattan pedestrians. A Blacktown car waited at the curb, its driver standing beside the open rear door with patient professionalism. "Mrs. Harrington," he said respectfully. Ava paused, the title lingering in the air like a memory that had already begun fading. She met the driver's eyes with calm clarity. "Not tonight," she said gently. The driver nodded without another word. Ava turned away from the waiting car and began walking south along Fifth Avenue, blending into the quiet rhythm of the city. Storefront windows glowed with designer displays, their reflections shimmering across the glass towers above. The empire William Harrington had built dominated headlines across the financial world. Yet tonight, somewhere between the Astoria Crown and the restless streets of Manhattan, something else had quietly begun. Ava Carter walked through the city without bodyguards, without a driver, without the name that once opened every door. What the world did not know, what William Harrington could not possibly imagine, was that the woman leaving his life tonight was the same woman who had once helped build the strategies behind his greatest victories. And when a strategist walks away from an empire, she does not disappear. She begins to study the battlefield. The city of Manhattan does not sleep, but it does remember. It remembers ambition. It remembers failure. And sometimes, quietly, it remembers the moment someone underestimated the wrong person. Ava Carter walked nearly 12 blocks before she finally slowed her pace. The cold autumn air brushed against her face, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor on the corner. Above her, skyscrapers stretched into the dark sky like silent witnesses. The same skyline she had once admired from the 42nd floor penthouse she shared with William Harrington. That penthouse was probably glowing with soft golden light at this very moment. The marble kitchen, the glass walls overlooking Central Park. The office where William had signed deals worth billions of dollars while Ava sat beside him quietly drafting the legal strategies that protected those deals. She stopped beneath a street lamp, its pale light casting a warm circle on the pavement. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Not in sadness, in clarity. Because humiliation can do something strange to the human mind. It can either crush a person completely, or it can strip away every illusion that once kept them comfortable. Ava Carter had never been a woman who relied on illusions. Long before she became Mrs. Harrington, long before society pages described her as the elegant wife of a technology billionaire, she had been something else entirely. She had been the daughter of a public school teacher in Baltimore. A girl who studied late into the night beneath a desk lamp while the rest of her neighborhood slept. A girl who believed that intelligence was not simply a talent, but a responsibility. Harvard Law School had noticed that responsibility. By the time Ava graduated, several prestigious firms had already offered her positions. But the path that eventually crossed with William Harrington's empire had come through strategy, not coincidence. 5 years earlier, Harrington Tech had been facing its first major legal threat from a competitor attempting a hostile takeover through regulatory pressure. Ava had been the strategist who quietly dismantled that attack piece by piece. Her legal memo from that case had eventually circulated among venture capital firms across Silicon Valley. It was precise, bold, and unusually predictive about market behavior. William Harrington had asked to meet the woman behind that analysis. Their first meeting had taken place in a quiet conference room overlooking the Hudson River. Ava still remembered the way he had studied her across the table, impressed by the calm confidence in her answers. At the time, he had introduced her to his board of investors with unmistakable admiration. This woman, William had said that afternoon, tapping the table for emphasis, just saved our company $300 million. The room had laughed with genuine respect. That same room of investors had later toasted their engagement with champagne. Ava opened her eyes again, returning to the present. A yellow taxi rushed past, splashing a faint mist from the street as it turned the corner. She slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat and continued walking. The truth was almost ironic. The man who had mocked her tonight believed he had created her life. The penthouse, the invitations, the reputation among New York's most powerful investors. But William Harrington had never fully understood something about Ava Carter. She had not married into power. She had always been capable of building it. For years, she had chosen partnership instead of competition. She had refined strategies behind the scenes, quietly shaping decisions that strengthened Harrington Tech's market position. The acquisitions that made headlines. The regulatory loopholes that saved millions. The timing of several major investments that analysts later called uncannily perfect. Ava knew the architecture of William Harrington's empire better than almost anyone alive, because she had helped design parts of it. A cold wind moved down the avenue, lifting the edge of her coat as she crossed the street. Somewhere far above, the lights of financial towers continued glowing like distant beacons. Ava Carter slowed again when she reached a small park overlooking the river. The water moved quietly in the darkness, reflecting scattered lights from the city. She rested her hands on the railing and looked out across the wide black surface. 5 years of marriage had ended in less than 5 minutes. But something else had begun tonight. Not revenge, not anger, something far more dangerous. Understanding. Because when a strategist studies a system long enough, she eventually realizes something important. Every empire has a weakness. And the woman standing quietly beside the river had just walked away from the only man who believed she would never use that knowledge. Morning arrived quietly over Manhattan, painting the glass towers with pale gold as the city woke to another day of ambition and negotiation. Inside the Harrington penthouse high above Central Park, the silence felt heavier than usual. William Harrington stood alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a cup of untouched coffee cooling on the marble counter behind him. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, yet his attention remained fixed on a small object resting on the dining table across the room. A thin platinum ring glimmered under the early sunlight. Ava's ring. The one she had removed the night before with calm precision before walking out of the Astoria Crown. William had returned home just after midnight, still irritated rather than reflective, assuming Ava would already be there waiting. But the penthouse had greeted him with stillness. No lights in the study. No quiet music drifting from the living room speakers. No Ava Carter sitting at the kitchen island reviewing documents while sipping herbal tea the way she often did after late events. Only silence and the ring she had left behind on the table after he returned with it from the restaurant. William crossed the room slowly, lifting the ring between his fingers. For a brief moment, he remembered the afternoon he had purchased it 5 years earlier. Napa Valley had been glowing with summer sunlight, vineyards stretching across the hills like green waves. Ava had laughed when he first showed it to her, not because of the price, but because of how serious he had looked while presenting it. She had said something simple that day, something he had not thought about in years. She had said respect mattered more than luxury. William turned the ring slightly, watching the light move across its surface. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, interrupting the quiet memory. A message from his executive assistant appeared on the screen, reminding him of the morning board meeting scheduled at 9 o'clock sharp. Investors from San Francisco were flying in to discuss a potential acquisition worth nearly $2 billion. William slipped the ring into his pocket without thinking and straightened his jacket. Business continued whether marriages survived or not. Harrington Tech had grown into one of the fastest rising technology firms in the country because William Harrington never allowed personal matters to slow down strategic decisions. 30 minutes later, his black sedan glided toward the towering glass headquarters of Harrington Tech in Midtown. The building stood like a monument to financial power, its polished steel reflecting the rising sun across neighboring skyscrapers. Employees moved quickly through the lobby, carrying laptops and coffee cups, each of them contributing to the engine that powered William's empire. When William entered the executive boardroom, the conversation stopped instantly. 12 investors sat around the long walnut table, their attention shifting toward him with professional expectation. Screens displayed market projections and acquisition charts across the walls. William took his seat at the head of the table and began outlining the day's agenda with practiced confidence. For nearly an hour, the discussion moved through financial forecasts, expansion strategies, and regulatory obstacles. William's voice remained steady, his mind sharp as always. Yet halfway through the meeting, something unexpected happened. One of the investors, a venture capitalist named Daniel Mercer, leaned forward with a curious expression. "William," Mercer said casually, glancing around the room, "I heard an interesting story last night from someone who attended the Astoria Crown dinner. They mentioned your wife left early." A faint ripple moved around the table. William's expression remained calm. "Ava had other priorities," he replied simply. Mercer nodded slowly, but his curiosity lingered. "That is surprising," he said. "Your wife has always been one of the sharpest legal minds connected to this company." William paused for a fraction of a second. The comment was not meant as criticism, yet something about hearing Ava described that way in a room full of investors felt strangely unfamiliar. He moved the meeting forward without acknowledging the remark further. But as the presentation continued, William found himself remembering something he had not considered in a long time. Many of Harrington Tech's earliest breakthroughs had emerged from strategies Ava had quietly developed behind the scenes. The regulatory defense that saved the company $300 million. The perfectly timed partnership with a cybersecurity startup that analysts later described as visionary. Ava Carter had never demanded recognition for those ideas. She simply solved problems and moved on to the next challenge. William adjusted the cuff of his shirt, returning his attention to the presentation screen. Outside the towering windows of the boardroom, the city continued expanding in every direction. New deals, new companies, new empires rising from the restless energy of Manhattan. What William Harrington did not yet realize was that somewhere within that same city, the woman who had once strengthened his empire was now beginning to imagine one of her own. 2 days after the dinner at the Astoria Crown, Manhattan continued its restless rhythm as though nothing unusual had happened. Morning sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Midtown, while thousands of professionals hurried through subway stations and crowded sidewalks with the quiet determination that defined the city. For most people, life moved forward without pause. But for Ava Carter, the next chapter had already begun in a small rented apartment on the Upper West Side. The space was modest compared to the penthouse she had once shared with William Harrington. A single large window overlooked a narrow street. lined with maple trees whose leaves had begun turning shades of copper and gold. The furniture was simple, practical, almost temporary. A wooden desk stood near the window with a laptop open beside several neatly stacked notebooks. Ava sat there early that morning, dressed in a charcoal sweater and dark slacks, her hair tied back in a quiet knot as sunlight filtered through the glass and illuminated the pages spread before her. Anyone passing outside might have assumed she was simply another professional preparing for a normal workday. They would never guess that the woman sitting in that quiet apartment possessed a mind capable of reshaping entire industries. Ava turned a page in one of the notebooks, studying a series of financial diagrams she had sketched late into the night. The diagrams mapped relationships between technology startups, venture capital groups, and regulatory patterns across several states. It looked less like casual notes and more like the blueprint of something precise and deliberate. Because Ava Carter had never believed that success was a matter of luck. Success was architecture, structure, timing, the same principles that she had used for years while advising Harrington Tech from the shadows. Her phone rested beside the laptop. At 9:30 in the morning it rang softly. The name on the screen made her smile faintly. Daniel Mercer, the same venture capitalist who had asked about her during the Harrington Tech board meeting the day before. Ava answered calmly. "Good morning, Daniel." Mercer's voice carried a tone of cautious curiosity. "Ava, I hope I am not interrupting anything." "Not at all," she replied. "I was expecting your call." There was a short pause on the line before Mercer spoke again. "Word travels quickly in New York," he said, "especially among investors. Many people noticed you were not at Harrington Tech this morning." Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, watching sunlight drift across the wooden desk. "I imagine that surprised some people." Mercer gave a quiet laugh. "More than some. Several people are wondering what you plan to do next." Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at the financial diagrams spread across the desk. For years, she had advised others on how to build companies. She had guided executives through crises and acquisitions while remaining comfortably behind the curtain of their success. But the dinner 2 nights earlier had erased something fundamental. It had removed the last reason she had for staying in someone else's shadow. "Daniel," she said calmly, "have you ever noticed that most venture firms follow the same pattern when investing in early technology companies?" Mercer sounded intrigued. "You mean their risk models?" "Exactly," Ava replied. "They chase trends instead of anticipating structural shifts. Artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, fintech. But very few investors study how regulatory policy will shape those markets 5 years in advance." Mercer grew silent for a moment as he processed her words. Ava continued gently. "The next major wave of technology investment will not be driven by innovation alone. It will be driven by compliance infrastructure, data governance, digital privacy frameworks. Whoever positions themselves at the intersection of those 3 sectors will control the next decade of venture capital growth." On the other end of the line, Mercer exhaled slowly. "You have already mapped this out, have you not?" Ava looked out the window toward the skyline of Manhattan, rising in the distance. "I have been studying it for 3 years," she said. Mercer's voice shifted into something closer to excitement. "Are you telling me you are building a firm?" Ava closed one of the notebooks and rested her hand calmly on the cover. "I am not building a firm," she said quietly. "I am building an ecosystem." Outside, the street below continued its ordinary morning routine. Delivery trucks moved past coffee shops. Pedestrians crossed intersections while glancing at their phones. None of them noticed the woman sitting beside the window in a quiet apartment, calmly outlining the structure of a future empire. And somewhere across Manhattan, inside a glass tower filled with investors and executives, William Harrington continued running the company that Ava Carter had once helped protect. What he did not yet understand was that the strategist who had walked away from his table was no longer studying his empire as an ally. She was studying it as a system. Within 3 weeks, the small apartment on the Upper West Side began to transform into something far more strategic than a temporary refuge. The wooden desk near the window no longer held only notebooks and diagrams. 2 additional monitors had been placed beside Ava Carter's laptop, each displaying streams of market data, venture capital reports, and regulatory filings from Washington. Outside, Manhattan continued its endless rhythm of taxis, coffee shops, and financial ambition, but inside the quiet apartment, a different kind of movement had begun. Ava sat calmly in her chair early that Monday morning, reviewing a detailed spreadsheet of technology startups across the United States. Hundreds of companies were listed in neat rows. Artificial intelligence firms in California, cybersecurity developers in Texas, data privacy infrastructure startups emerging quietly in Boston and Chicago. Many investors still considered those sectors secondary compared to more glamorous technology fields. Ava saw something else entirely. She saw the skeleton of the next economic wave. Her phone vibrated on the desk. Another message from Daniel Mercer appeared, this time containing a list of potential early investors who had privately expressed interest in hearing her ideas. Ava read the names carefully. Some were well-known venture capitalists who had built fortunes predicting market shifts. Others were smaller independent investors searching for their first major breakthrough. She did not rush to respond. Timing had always been her greatest advantage. Instead, she opened a folder on her laptop labeled Carter Strategic Holdings. The name had appeared only a few days earlier, registered quietly through a corporate law firm that specialized in discrete financial structures. Ava studied the document for a moment, then began outlining the firm's first 3 investment targets. The companies themselves were small, almost invisible to the larger venture capital world. But their technology addressed exactly the regulatory challenges that governments were preparing to enforce across digital industries. Data sovereignty frameworks, secure identity verification protocols, artificial intelligence audit compliance tools. Individually, those startups seemed modest. Together, they formed the backbone of a future ecosystem that could quietly influence billions of dollars in global technology policy. Ava leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Years of observing Harrington Tech had taught her something essential about power. Most empires believed their strength came from size. But real control often came from infrastructure, the systems that everyone depended on but rarely noticed. Her phone rang again. This time the caller identification displayed another familiar name. Olivia Bennett. Ava answered with a warm smile. Olivia, it has been a long time. Olivia Bennett had once been Ava's colleague during their early years in corporate law. Unlike many lawyers who remained inside traditional firms, Olivia had eventually moved into private equity consulting, advising investors on how to structure emerging funds. Her voice carried a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Ava, the entire city is talking about you. Someone told me you walked away from Harrington Tech. Ava's tone remained calm. I walked away from a dinner table. Olivia laughed softly. That sounds like you. Quiet and precise. So what happens next? Ava turned her chair slightly toward the window. The skyline of Manhattan stretched across the horizon, its towers reflecting morning sunlight like mirrors of possibility. Next, she said slowly, I build something that cannot be laughed at. Olivia remained silent for a moment before asking the obvious question. Do you already have investors? Ava glanced back toward the spreadsheets glowing on her monitors. I have something better, she replied. I have foresight. Across the river, the glass headquarters of Harrington Tech continued its daily operations without interruption. Employees entered conference rooms carrying presentations. Engineers tested new software platforms. Investors monitored market fluctuations from their offices overlooking Midtown. William Harrington moved through the building with the same composed authority that had made him one of the most respected technology leaders in the country. What none of them yet understood was that a quiet shift had begun just beyond the edges of their attention. Because when Ava Carter studied markets, she did not simply follow opportunities. She created them. And somewhere within the complex machinery of global technology finance, the first invisible gears of her new empire had already started turning. By the time winter began touching the rooftops of Manhattan with thin sheets of frost, the quiet structure Ava Carter had started building no longer resembled a temporary venture. Carter Strategic Holdings had moved out of the Upper West Side apartment and into a modest office space on the 21st floor of a renovated brick building in Tribeca. The office was not extravagant. There were no marble hallways or private elevators like those inside Harrington Tech. Instead, there were open desks, large windows overlooking the Hudson River, and a single conference table made of reclaimed oak where ideas were debated with calm precision. Yet inside those walls something powerful was unfolding. The 3 early startups Ava had invested in only 2 months earlier were already gaining attention. one specialized in digital identity verification systems required for government contracts. Another developed artificial intelligence auditing tools designed to ensure compliance with new federal data transparency rules. The third built secure cloud architecture specifically designed for financial institutions preparing for stricter privacy legislation. Individually, the companies remained small, but together they formed the backbone of a rapidly emerging infrastructure network. Ava stood near the office window one cold afternoon, reviewing a report on her tablet while snow drifted slowly across the river outside. Olivia Bennett entered the room carrying a stack of investor briefings and placed them on the conference table. The Boston compliance firm just signed their first federal contract, Olivia said. They called your office this morning to thank you for believing in them before anyone else did. Ava glanced up briefly. Success tends to attract gratitude. Olivia smiled slightly. And attention. She slid one of the briefings toward Ava. The document displayed a financial analysis produced by a large venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. At the center of the report, a name appeared repeatedly. Carter Strategic Holdings. Ava read the report quietly. Analysts had begun describing her investments as unusually predictive. Several venture funds were already trying to purchase minority stakes in the same startups she had backed months earlier. Ava set the tablet down. They are beginning to notice the pattern, she said. Olivia folded her arms. Including Harrington Tech. Ava did not respond immediately. Across the river, the skyline of Midtown shimmered under pale winter sunlight. Somewhere inside those towers, William Harrington continued running one of the largest technology companies in the country. For weeks, his analysts had been studying the same reports, now circulating through venture capital circles. A cluster of startups suddenly gaining momentum. A new investment firm appearing in early funding rounds with surprising consistency. The name Carter Strategic Holdings had surfaced in 3 separate industry briefings within the past 10 days. Back inside the Tribeca office, Olivia watched Ava carefully. You knew this moment would come, she said. Ava nodded slightly. Recognition is inevitable once the structure becomes visible. Olivia walked toward the whiteboard at the far wall where Ava had expanded her original diagrams into a much larger network of companies, regulators, and investment flows. Several new lines connected the startups directly to major financial institutions preparing for new data governance laws. You are building something much bigger than a venture fund, Olivia said quietly. Ava picked up a marker and added one final arrow connecting the 3 startups to a 4th company currently under negotiation. Venture funds chase profit, Ava said calmly. Ecosystems create dependency. Olivia studied the diagram with growing admiration. Once these systems become standard across the industry, she said slowly, every major technology company will rely on them. Ava placed the marker back on the table. Exactly. At that same moment inside Harrington Tech headquarters, William Harrington stood in his office reviewing a new market analysis that had just arrived from his strategic advisory team. The report described a rapidly emerging compliance infrastructure network gaining traction across multiple technology sectors. At the center of the investment pattern appeared the same name again, Carter Strategic Holdings. William studied the report for several seconds before setting it down slowly on his desk. Something about the strategic precision behind those investments felt strangely familiar, almost personal. Outside the glass wall of his office, Manhattan continued its endless movement of traffic and ambition. What William Harrington had not yet realized was that the woman who once quietly protected his empire was now designing the foundation of another one. And unlike Harrington Tech, this new empire had been built from the very beginning with complete independence. Winter settled firmly over Manhattan as January winds swept through the narrow streets of Tribeca, carrying the sharp scent of cold air and distant coffee shops opening before sunrise. Inside the Carter Strategic Holdings office, the quiet focus of early morning work filled the space long before most of the city had fully awakened. Ava Carter stood at the large conference table reviewing a series of updated market reports, while soft light from the rising sun filtered through the tall, industrial windows. The company had grown faster than even Olivia Bennett originally predicted. What had begun as 3 strategic investments had now expanded into a network of 9 interconnected startups across the country. Each company operated in a different corner of the rapidly evolving compliance technology sector, Yet together they formed a framework that analysts were beginning to describe as a foundational layer for the next generation of digital infrastructure. Ava traced one line on the digital display mounted beside the table, following the path of a recent contract awarded to the Boston identity verification firm she had backed months earlier. The contract came from a consortium of major banks preparing for new federal data protection rules scheduled to take effect within 2 years. Olivia entered the office carrying a tablet and a small folder of printed documents. She set them down beside Ava and exhaled quietly. The market is catching on. Faster than expected, Olivia said. Ava glanced at the screen of the tablet Olivia had placed in front of her. Several financial news outlets had published early analysis that morning describing Carter Strategic Holdings as one of the most strategically positioned new investment entities in the technology compliance sector. Ava read the article calmly, her expression unchanged. Recognition is a delayed reaction, she said softly. Olivia folded her arms and leaned against the table. One particular reader noticed immediately. Ava looked up slightly. Olivia tapped the tablet screen, revealing a second report produced by the Strategic Intelligence Division of Harrington Tech. The report analyzed the emerging compliance infrastructure network and identified Carter Strategic Holdings as the primary investor behind several of the fastest-growing companies in the sector. Ava studied the document for several seconds. William Harrington's company had clearly begun investigating the pattern of investments she had quietly orchestrated. Across Midtown inside the glass tower of Harrington Tech, William sat in his office reviewing the same intelligence report with increasing attention. The document detailed the rapid rise of several startups whose services were becoming essential for companies navigating new regulatory frameworks. At the center of those investments appeared the same unfamiliar firm, Carter Strategic Holdings. William tapped his pen lightly against the desk as he studied the report again. Something about the investment structure seemed almost deliberate in its precision. Each company filled a gap that Harrington Tech itself would soon need to address in order to expand into government contracts and international markets. His chief strategy officer had written a note at the bottom of the report recommending that Harrington Tech begin negotiations to acquire at least 2 of the startups before competitors recognized their strategic value. William leaned back slowly in his chair. Outside his office window, the skyline of Manhattan glowed under pale winter sunlight, the same skyline Ava Carter had once admired from the penthouse they shared. He turned the page of the report again, this time focusing on the name of the investment firm responsible for the early funding, Carter Strategic Holdings. The name lingered in his mind with a strange familiarity. Meanwhile, in the Tribeca office, Ava closed the report Olivia had brought and walked toward the window overlooking the Hudson River. Snow flurries drifted lightly through the cold air, while ferries moved slowly across the gray water below. Olivia watched her with growing curiosity. If Harrington Tech starts buying these companies, Olivia asked carefully, what will you do? Ava rested her hands lightly on the windowsill while studying the distant towers of Midtown rising above the winter haze. For years, she had helped design strategies that strengthened William Harrington's empire. Now she understood its expansion patterns better than anyone. Ava turned back toward the conference table with calm certainty. They will not buy them, she said quietly. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Why not? Ava walked back to the digital board and highlighted 3 new company names that had appeared on the network diagram only days earlier. Because by the time they try, she said, the ecosystem will already belong to someone else. The room fell silent for a moment as Olivia absorbed the meaning of those words. Outside the office, the winter wind continued sweeping through the streets of Manhattan, carrying with it the quiet momentum of a city where fortunes rose and fell every day. But inside Carter Strategic Holdings, the strategist who had once stood beside William Harrington's empire was now calmly preparing the moment when their paths would cross again, this time on entirely different terms. Late February brought a strange shift in the atmosphere of Manhattan's technology sector. The snow had begun to melt along the sidewalks, revealing the restless rhythm of the city returning beneath the gray winter sky. Financial reporters who normally focused on artificial intelligence startups and cryptocurrency markets had started discussing a different subject during morning broadcasts: compliance infrastructure, data governance, digital regulatory architecture. It was not the most glamorous topic, but within the quiet language of investors it carried enormous significance. Inside the Tribeca office of Carter Strategic Holdings, Ava Carter stood at the long oak conference table reviewing a series of financial projections displayed across 3 large monitors. The room had grown busier over the past several weeks. Analysts now worked from several desks along the wall, studying regulatory filings and emerging contract bids from federal agencies preparing to enforce new digital oversight rules. Olivia Bennett walked into the conference room holding a printed market bulletin and placed it gently beside Ava. "The first wave has officially begun," she said. Ava glanced down at the bulletin. A major technology news outlet had just confirmed that several multinational corporations were beginning to restructure their data management systems to comply with upcoming federal digital accountability standards. The article highlighted 3 companies already positioned to provide those services. All 3 were backed by Carter Strategic Holdings. Ava studied the report calmly before folding it and placing it aside. Olivia watched her closely. "This is exactly the moment you predicted 6 months ago," she said. Ava walked slowly toward the large digital board mounted on the wall. The network diagram that once contained only a handful of startups had now expanded into a complex system connecting financial institutions, government contractors, cloud infrastructure providers, and compliance technology firms across the country. Several of those connections had recently activated as new contracts were signed. Ava traced one line across the screen with her finger. "Momentum has a natural rhythm," she said quietly. "Once the system reaches a certain threshold, it begins accelerating on its own." Olivia crossed her arms thoughtfully. "And Harrington Tech?" Ava paused briefly before answering. Across Midtown inside the towering headquarters of Harrington Tech, William Harrington had spent the entire morning reviewing an alarming set of projections from his strategy team. The compliance technology companies appearing across the industry were rapidly becoming essential partners for firms seeking access to government contracts and international markets. Several of those firms had already signed exclusive infrastructure agreements that made acquisition nearly impossible. Each time William's team traced the early investment pattern behind those companies, the same name surfaced repeatedly: Carter Strategic Holdings. William stood near the window of his office, the intelligence report resting open on the desk behind him. The structure of the investments no longer looked coincidental. Someone had anticipated the regulatory shift long before most analysts recognized it. Whoever controlled that network of startups would soon hold extraordinary leverage over the future of enterprise technology compliance. William turned back toward his desk and picked up the report again. At the bottom of the document, one of his senior advisors had written a short recommendation: "Identify the leadership behind Carter Strategic Holdings immediately." Meanwhile, in Tribeca, the afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Ava's office, casting long golden reflections across the conference table. Olivia watched Ava studying the expanding network displayed on the digital board. "You knew they would eventually start investigating," Olivia said. Ava nodded slightly. "That was inevitable." Olivia tilted her head. "Are you ready for that conversation?" Ava allowed herself the faintest smile. She turned off the digital display and gathered several documents from the table before answering calmly. "They will not begin with a conversation," she said. "They will begin with an offer." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "And when Harrington Tech offers to buy the entire ecosystem?" Ava walked toward the window overlooking the river where the fading winter sunlight reflected across the water. For a moment, she watched the distant skyline of Midtown rising across the horizon, the same skyline where William Harrington continued searching for answers. Ava's voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "Then they will discover something very important," she said quietly. Olivia waited. Ava turned back toward the conference table with calm certainty. Empires cannot purchase what they do not understand. And somewhere across Manhattan, inside the glass towers of Harrington Tech, the first steps had already begun toward a meeting neither of them could avoid. Early March arrived with a quiet tension spreading through the financial corridors of Manhattan. Snow had disappeared from the sidewalks, replaced by the sharp wind of early spring that carried the restless energy of a city preparing for another cycle of ambition and negotiation. Inside the Tribeca headquarters of Carter Strategic Holdings, the atmosphere remained calm but focused. Analysts moved quietly between desks reviewing new contract proposals, while Olivia Bennett stood near the conference table organizing a stack of legal documents for an upcoming investor meeting. Ava Carter remained near the tall windows overlooking the Hudson River, reading a message that had appeared on her phone only minutes earlier. The sender was unfamiliar, but the organization behind the message was not. Harrington Tech Corporate Strategy Division. Ava read the brief email carefully before placing the phone down on the table beside her tablet. Olivia noticed the change in her expression immediately. "That looks important," she said. Ava turned the phone screen toward her. The message was formal, concise, and exactly what Ava had predicted weeks earlier. Harrington Tech wished to request a private meeting with the leadership of Carter Strategic Holdings to discuss potential strategic collaboration opportunities. Olivia leaned back slowly, letting out a quiet breath. "So the invitation has arrived." Ava nodded once. "Right on schedule." Olivia studied her face for any sign of hesitation, but found none. "Do you think William Harrington knows who he is about to meet?" Ava glanced toward the skyline of Midtown rising across the river. The towers of Manhattan glimmered under the pale sunlight of early afternoon, including the glass headquarters where Harrington Tech continued expanding its influence across the technology industry. "He suspects," Ava said calmly. "But suspicion is not certainty." Olivia picked up the printed copy of the message again. "They are offering to host the meeting at their executive boardroom tomorrow morning." Ava smiled faintly at that detail. "Of course they are." Across the river inside Harrington Tech headquarters, William Harrington stood near the long conference table of the executive boardroom, reviewing the preparations for the meeting he had requested. The strategy division had spent several days attempting to uncover the leadership structure behind Carter Strategic Holdings. The firm had been deliberately quiet about its internal organization. No public interviews. No press announcements. Only carefully structured investments appearing at precisely the right moments across the compliance technology sector. But William had studied enough of the pattern to recognize something unmistakable within it. The precision, the timing, the anticipation of regulatory shifts before they became public policy. It reminded him of someone he once knew very well. One of his senior advisors approached the table holding a tablet. "The Carter Strategic Holdings representative confirmed the meeting for tomorrow morning," the advisor said. William nodded slowly. "Did they provide a name?" The advisor shook his head. "Only that their founder will attend personally." William looked down at the digital presentation displayed across the large screen in the room. It outlined the growing influence of the compliance infrastructure network Carter Strategic Holdings had assembled over the past several months. The network now touched nearly every sector Harrington Tech intended to expand into over the next 5 years. If the ecosystem continued growing at its current pace, it would soon become impossible for any major technology firm to operate without interacting with it. William folded his arms thoughtfully. "Tomorrow morning," he repeated quietly. Back in Tribeca, the Carter Strategic Holdings office had grown quiet as evening approached. The analysts had left for the day, leaving only Ava and Olivia standing near the conference table reviewing the final preparations for the meeting. Olivia closed the folder of documents and looked at Ava carefully. "It has been months since that dinner," she said softly. Ava picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "Yes." Olivia hesitated for a moment before asking the question she had been wondering about since the message arrived. "What happens tomorrow when you walk into that boardroom?" Ava paused near the window one last time before leaving the office. Across the river, the lights of Midtown had begun turning on one by one as evening settled over the city. Somewhere within those towers, William Harrington was preparing to meet the strategist who had quietly reshaped the future of his industry. Ava's voice remained calm when she finally answered. "Tomorrow," she said gently, "William Harrington will finally understand what he laughed at." The following morning, Manhattan awoke beneath a pale sky washed with early spring light, the kind that reflected softly across the endless glass towers of Midtown and made the city look almost calm before the usual rush of business began. At exactly 8:45, a black car pulled to the curb in front of Harrington Tech headquarters, its polished surface reflecting the towering steel structure rising above it. Ava Carter stepped out onto the sidewalk with the same composed grace she had carried into every negotiation room of her career. She wore a deep crimson coat over a tailored black dress, the color catching the morning light like quiet armor. Pedestrians moved past without noticing her, unaware that the woman walking toward the revolving glass doors had quietly reshaped the infrastructure of an entire industry in less than a year. Inside the lobby, the marble floors gleamed beneath bright ceiling lights, while employees hurried toward elevators carrying tablets and coffee cups. Ava moved through the space with calm familiarity, as if she had never left. In many ways she had not. She had once walked through this building nearly every week beside William Harrington, advising legal teams and shaping strategy meetings that helped Harrington Tech rise from a promising startup into a dominant technology firm. Now she returned not as a partner behind the scenes, but as the architect of a rival system powerful enough to challenge that empire directly. Upstairs in the executive boardroom, William Harrington stood beside the long walnut table reviewing the final briefing documents prepared by his strategy team. The room's enormous windows overlooked the skyline stretching toward the river, the city appearing limitless beneath the morning sun. One of his advisors adjusted a presentation screen displaying the network of compliance technology companies that had recently transformed the regulatory landscape. At the center of the diagram appeared the same name again, Carter Strategic Holdings. William studied the diagram with quiet focus. Months earlier, he had dismissed the name as an emerging venture firm. Now the pattern behind those investments had become impossible to ignore. Whoever had designed that ecosystem understood the future of digital governance with extraordinary precision. A soft knock interrupted the room. His assistant stepped inside. The Carter Strategic Holdings representative has arrived. William nodded slowly. Please show them in. Moments later, the boardroom doors opened. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to fall silent. Ava Carter stepped inside with the same calm expression she had worn the night she walked away from the dinner table months earlier. Several executives around the table recognized her instantly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to surprise. William Harrington did not speak at first. He simply looked at her across the length of the table as the realization settled quietly into place. The strategist behind Carter Strategic Holdings. The architect of the infrastructure network reshaping the industry. The woman standing before him was the same person he had once introduced to investors as the sharpest legal mind he had ever met. Ava removed her coat and placed it over the back of a chair before sitting down opposite him. Her movements remained measured, composed, almost serene. No anger, no hesitation, only clarity. William finally broke the silence. Ava. Her name left his voice almost as a statement rather than a question. Ava met his eyes with calm confidence. Good morning, William. One of the executives cleared his throat awkwardly, unsure how to interpret the tension now filling the room. William slowly folded the report he had been reviewing and placed it on the table between them. So Carter Strategic Holdings, he said quietly. Ava nodded slightly. Yes. William studied her for several seconds before continuing. You built the entire network. Ava rested her hands lightly on the table. I designed the foundation. The room remained silent as the weight of that statement settled across the boardroom. Outside the towering windows, the city continued moving with its usual relentless energy, unaware that inside this quiet room, two empires had finally come face to face. William leaned back in his chair, absorbing the reality of what stood before him. Months earlier, he had laughed at the woman across this table. Now the infrastructure shaping the future of his entire industry belonged to her. Ava allowed a small pause before speaking again, her voice calm but unmistakably steady. Your team mentioned strategic collaboration, she said gently. William looked at the diagram still glowing on the screen behind her, then back at Ava Carter. For the first time since that night at the dinner table, he understood exactly what had walked away from him. The boardroom remained silent for several long seconds after Ava Carter spoke, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from realization. Outside the towering glass walls of Harrington Tech headquarters, Manhattan continued moving with its familiar rhythm of ambition and opportunity. Yet inside the room, something far more personal had settled between two people who once shared the same future. William Harrington studied Ava carefully across the length of the table. Months earlier, he had watched her stand up from a luxury dinner table and walk away without raising her voice. At the time, he believed the moment had ended there, a quiet closing of a chapter he barely paused to consider. Now the consequences of that moment sat calmly in front of him, wearing a crimson coat, and the quiet confidence of someone who had rebuilt an empire from the ground up. William finally leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the polished wood surface of the table. Your ecosystem controls the compliance infrastructure pipeline for nearly half the technology companies entering federal contract markets, he said slowly. Ava did not appear surprised by the statement. The number is closer to 60%, she replied calmly. Several executives around the table shifted in their chairs, clearly realizing the full weight of that number for the first time. William let out a quiet breath before continuing. You anticipated the regulatory shift before most analysts even saw it coming. Ava met his gaze steadily. The signs were there for anyone willing to look beyond quarterly profits. William almost smiled at that. He remembered hearing the same tone in her voice years earlier during strategy meetings when she explained legal frameworks others overlooked. Back then he had admired it. Somewhere along the way he had simply stopped listening. He sat back in his chair, the reality of the situation settling fully into place. Harrington Tech could spend years attempting to replicate what Ava had already built, but the network she created had momentum now. Contracts had been signed. Infrastructure agreements were active. Entire sectors were already beginning to depend on the systems her companies provided. William looked toward the presentation screen showing the expanding network of firms linked through Carter Strategic Holdings, then back to Ava Carter sitting calmly across from him. So tell me, he said quietly, what exactly does collaboration mean in this situation? Ava folded her hands lightly on the table. Her answer came without hesitation. It means partnership on equal terms. One of the senior executives spoke for the first time. You are proposing a joint infrastructure framework between Carter Strategic Holdings and Harrington Tech? Ava nodded slightly. Your company dominates large-scale enterprise platforms. My network provides the regulatory architecture those platforms now require. William studied her expression carefully. There was no triumph in her voice. No bitterness. Only clarity. And if Harrington Tech refuses? He asked. Ava allowed a small pause before answering. Then other companies will not. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any threat could have. The room fell silent again as the executives around the table understood exactly what that meant. Ava Carter was not asking for recognition. She was offering access to a system that would soon become essential to the entire industry. William looked down at the thin platinum ring he had absent-mindedly placed on the table earlier that morning while reviewing reports. He had carried it in his pocket for months without quite knowing why. Now the small circle of metal rested between them like a quiet symbol of a decision he once believed was insignificant. He picked it up slowly and turned it between his fingers for a moment before speaking again. You built an empire, he said. Ava's eyes remained steady. I built a future. William nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that difference. After a moment, he placed the ring back on the table and pushed it gently toward her. Ava looked down at it briefly before lifting her gaze again. The past does not require returning, she said softly. William understood immediately. Some things, once broken, were never meant to be restored. But that did not mean they could not lead to something else. Outside the boardroom windows, the skyline of Manhattan shimmered under the late morning sun, a city built by people who had walked away from defeat and returned stronger than before. Ava Carter stood up from the table and gathered her coat with calm composure. Have your team contact mine, she said. We will discuss the framework details. William watched her move toward the door with the same quiet confidence he had once admired years earlier. Only now he understood something he had missed before. The woman he once laughed at had never been standing behind his empire. She had simply been deciding whether to build her own. And now the entire city would have to learn her name.